Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Picture this. I was standing in my parents' backyard on a warm Saturday afternoon, balancing a glass of sweet tea in one hand and a casserole dish in the other, when my brother Ryan was presented with something that looked more like a coronation than a family get-together. They didn't just pat him on the back and say, "Good job, son." No, they handed him the deed to an entire house, wrapped in a neat little folder with a shiny ribbon on top, as if it were nothing more than a graduation card. I remember blinking, half convinced I was imagining it, because the last time I had asked my parents for even a fraction of help, back when I needed a few $1,000s for college tuition, I had been told, very firmly, that we're not made of money. Yet here they were, acting like Oprah on a giveaway special, except instead of shouting, "You get a car," they were practically singing, "Ryan gets a house," while the rest of us looked on. I wish I could tell you I smiled politely, that I swallowed the bitterness rising up in my throat and just let it slide, but in truth my jaw nearly hit the ground. Ryan stood there like he'd earned it, smirking in his brand new golf shirt, while I thought about every late night I'd worked double shifts at the diner just to cover rent. He was basking in the spotlight, and all I could think was how unfairly scripted my role had been in this family drama. Ryan, the golden child, always the favorite, could blow through opportunities like tissues and still land cushioned on a safety net, while I was told over and over that independence was a virtue and that life would teach me resilience. The party atmosphere didn't make things any easier. There were balloons, barbecue, relatives clapping him on the back, people toasting his new beginnings. One cousin even asked me if I was jealous, and I had to bite my tongue so hard I nearly tasted blood. I forced a laugh, told her it was great for Ryan, but inside, I wanted to scream. My parents had just rewritten the rules of fairness in permanent ink, and I knew exactly where I stood on their scoreboard. The invisible daughter, the responsible one, the one who didn't need help, the one who was supposed to clap for everyone else's success while quietly cleaning up her own messes. What really burned was the way my mom beamed at me when she saw my expression, as if daring me to say something, as if she already had the defense prepared. "Ryan has been under a lot of stress," she whispered when we found ourselves side by side by the buffet table. "This house is going to help him settle down." I almost laughed out loud. Settle down? Ryan hadn't settled down since the day he figured out he could charm his way out of every consequence. He was the kind of man who could run up a tab he had no intention of paying and then look the waiter in the eye with a grin so disarming that somehow the bill vanished. By the end of the evening, I was exhausted from smiling through gritted teeth, from listening to my father talk about family legacy and how proud he was to see Ryan finally take responsibility with this house. Responsibility? The man could barely keep track of his car keys, and now they were entrusting him with a mortgage-free piece of property. I left that night with a hollow feeling, the kind that gnaws at you long after you've pulled out of the driveway. A week later, just when I had finally pushed the sting of that party to the back of my mind, I heard the knock on my apartment door. It was one of those deliberate knocks, the kind that carries weight, the kind that says whoever's on the other side isn't here for small talk. I opened it to find both of my parents standing there, faces tight, smiles forced, carrying the kind of tension you can smell before a single word is spoken. I invited them in, poured coffee, tried to ignore the pit growing in my stomach. My mother fiddled with her necklace. My father cleared his throat 3 times before he finally said it. "We need to talk," he began, and then came the sentence that made every muscle in my body tense like a coiled spring. "It's about Ryan." And just like that, I knew. The housewarming gift wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning, and whatever was coming next was going to be worse. Much worse. They sat on my couch like 2 people rehearsing grief without deciding who should start the show, and after a very long sip of coffee that neither of them tasted, my father, who usually only speaks in pronouncements or weather reports, finally admitted that Ryan was not just stressed, not just finding his footing, but neck-deep in late notices, collection calls, and a stack of unpaid bills that looked like a phone book dressed as a threat, and, while he tried to soften it with talk about the economy, and how everyone's juggling something. My mother cut through the performance with the kind of bluntness she only uses when she needs something from me, explaining that they had already moved money around, tapped a retirement account that was supposed to fund road trips and little seaside rentals, covered one credit card with another, and even paid off a payday loan that charged interest like it hated us on principle. I listened without interrupting, because I learned a long time ago that the first version of the story is rarely the true one, and as they described a mess that sounded less like a mistake and more like a sport Ryan had trained for. I watched their faces for the detail they were trying to hide, and sure enough, it came tucked inside a line that tried to sound responsible. The bank would approve a consolidation loan large enough to roll his credit cards, back taxes, and the late truck payments into something manageable, but only if a cosigner with clean credit agreed to carry the weight. And since I was the stable one, the one who paid her rent on time and filed her taxes early and didn't treat due dates as creative writing prompts, they thought I might step up for the family and put my name next to his. For a moment the room went quiet except for the hum of my refrigerator and the muffled tick of the clock I never notice until I need an excuse to breathe, and I pictured my signature, neat and loyal, sitting beside his name like a seatbelt on a roller coaster he would still decide to stand up on, and I felt a cold anger rise that made my chest feel like someone had cinched it with a belt, because I remembered every time I was told to be independent, every shift I stayed late to cover tuition, when help would have cost them less than what they now shoveled into Ryan's furnace of a lifestyle, and I remembered the look on my mother's face at the party, the one that said this family has an order and you know your place in it. I asked questions, not the angry ones yet, but the kind that make people tidy up their stories, and they answered in crumbs that did not add up to a meal. Apparently there was a gambling app here and there, a few weekends at a casino with friends, a sports betting thing he barely touched, and then a truck he needed for work, even though his work changes every season like a menu, and there were taxes that fell through the cracks, which is a poetic way to describe simply ignoring the letters with the government logo, and as they spoke I felt the shape of the truth harden. Not a single disaster, but a routine of soft landings followed by louder jumps. I wanted to laugh, or maybe cry, or maybe drag that shiny ribbon deed onto my coffee table and ask why we pretend that gifts are investments when they are really just bandages for old favoritism, but instead I did something worse. Something I knew they would recognize as hope because that is the lever that moves them. I said I would think about it, that I would review his paperwork, that if we were going to do this we would do it by the book with no secrets and no surprises, and when my mother exhaled like she had been holding her breath for a month and my father squeezed my hand in that stiff, grateful way he has when he wins, I smiled back, sweet as syrup on a burned pancake, and said we would need Ryan present for every step, every form, every explanation. After they left, the apartment felt like a stage after the audience goes home, and I opened my laptop, not for social media or a glass of wine pity scroll, but for a deep dive into the kind of digital footprint a person leaves when they live like consequences are a rumor, and within an hour I had found the publicly visible pieces that tell an unflattering truth even when the private ones hide. Like the registry of liens that mentioned his truck, the county records that showed a notice tied to an unpaid contractor, the local court calendar where his name sat beside a small claims hearing over a broken lease, and a hint of something uglier in a forum thread about sports betting where a username that looked far too familiar bragged about a parlay that finally hit on a weekend. I distinctly remember my parents transferring money for an emergency. I printed what mattered and slid the pages into a plain folder, and then I did something that probably counts as petty, maybe even cruel in a way only a responsible person learns to be. Because revenge for people like me does not come with fireworks or confessions, it arrives with a calendar reminder and a polite email. I scheduled a meeting with the loan officer they had named, told her I would bring my brother and my parents to walk through every clause, and then, because kindness and clarity can be the sharpest knives, I also sent Ryan a message that sounded cooperative but carried a hook, telling him I had found a small credit builder program he could join before the appointment to show effort, a program that, entirely by coincidence, requires strict monthly check-ins, a budgeting workshop, and a temporary freeze on discretionary spending flagged by the bank as entertainment and gaming, which meant that if he wanted my signature, he would have to live, for once, in a world where the numbers tell the truth. Before bed, I called an old coworker who now works in compliance and asked hypotheticals about risk and disclosure, and while I kept names out of it, I learned just enough to understand that sunlight, when applied in the right places, makes certain messes impossible to keep under the rug, and as I set my phone down I felt a calm I had not felt in weeks, because I realized the first small piece of justice was already in motion. By pretending to consider their plan, I had dragged the conversation out of the shadows and into a room with bright lights, clipped pens, and witness chairs, which is where fair deals are born and bad habits come to die. When Ryan texted back with a thumbs up and a line about teamwork, I stared at the screen until the bubble faded, then set my alarm and closed my eyes, already picturing him trying to sweet-talk a bank form while the loan officer, who has seen every story twice, waits for him to read a paragraph out loud. And as sleep tugged at me, I felt the smallest, sharpest smile, because the next move would be his, the spotlight would be harsh, and I could already hear the creak of a door opening to a room where charm does not pay the bill. As I began pulling together every piece of information I could find, I realized that what my parents had described to me as temporary troubles and a few oversights was actually an entire ecosystem of irresponsibility that had been nurtured and protected by the family for years, and as I scrolled through bank statements, court notices, and public records, I could see with absolute clarity that Ryan's lifestyle had never been constrained by the rules the rest of us lived under, and that every dollar, every favor, every leniency he had received was a carefully engineered safety net that allowed him to gamble weekends away, lease expensive cars he did not need, and indulge in vacations that cost more than the rent I had worked to pay during my college years, all while my parents stood by, applauding his confidence and brushing aside his mistakes with words like, "He's learning," and "He's young," and "He'll figure it out eventually," which to me sounded less like guidance and more like a well-rehearsed excuse to keep enabling a person who had no intention of ever being responsible. I found emails that detailed how my parents had dipped into retirement accounts they had promised to themselves, using those funds not for family experiences or their own well-being, but to cover Ryan's gambling losses and delinquent bills. And as I read through each message, the tone became almost surreal, as if they were negotiating with a child who had just dropped a vase and promised it would never happen again, and every line was punctuated with hope and fear for him, completely ignoring the responsibility he owed to anyone else in the family, and I felt a wave of anger mixed with disbelief, because I had always known favoritism existed, but I had never realized how calculated it could be. How carefully it was hidden behind smiles, parties, and assurances that everything was fine. I also discovered that some of his debt was a result of loans they had co-signed on his behalf, loans that were now past due, showing interest compounding like a quiet storm, and while they had painted this as a crisis that needed my immediate attention, the truth was that they had been quietly shuffling money and promises for years, creating a perfect storm that now, conveniently, required my name, my credit, my stability to rescue him from the consequences that my parents had avoided facing. And as I pieced together the timeline, I could see patterns of behavior I had not noticed before. Every gift, every financial indulgence, every indulgent holiday had not only reinforced his sense of entitlement, but had also placed my parents in a position where they could manipulate the narrative, leaving me as the only person with a clean record who could legally sign off on their mess. Anger surged, but I held it in, because I knew the most powerful forms of revenge are not immediate or loud, but slow, deliberate, and inevitable. And I began to construct a strategy that would allow me to appear cooperative while making the truth of Ryan's mismanagement impossible to ignore, and I smiled in the quiet of my apartment, because while my parents and brother had built a narrative in which I would be the savior, I was about to introduce an element of reality into a world that had been carefully insulated from it for years. I scheduled a meeting with the loan officer they had named, arranging a time that I knew would force my family to show up, and I made sure Ryan understood that every single detail of his financial history would be scrutinized, that the forms required full disclosure, and that nothing could be hidden behind charm or smiles. And as I sent the message, I imagined his eyes widening when the paperwork was laid before him, when the consequences of every gamble, every late payment, every indulgence were no longer abstract threats, but numbers, deadlines, and official documents that could no longer be ignored. Behind the veneer of cooperation, I contacted a former coworker who worked in compliance to run hypotheticals, not naming anyone, just discussing potential red flags and obligations. And the answers I received reinforced the certainty that transparency, when wielded correctly, could force accountability without me having to do more than observe, guide, and subtly push. And the realization filled me with a quiet satisfaction that was more powerful than any immediate confrontation could have been. Because I understood that control, when exercised patiently, could be far more humiliating and effective than rage. By the time I went to bed, the house was silent except for the soft tick of my clock and the hum of the refrigerator, and I lay awake thinking about the coming confrontation, about Ryan reading clauses he had never considered, about my parents squirming under the pressure of their own enabling, and about the way truth has a way of bending pride into uncomfortable shapes, and I felt a calm certainty that whatever happened next, the scales were beginning to shift. That I had taken the first decisive step in a game they thought they controlled, and that by pretending to consider their plan, I had placed myself in a position where the next move would not be theirs, and when the morning came, I knew I would watch the beginning of a reckoning that was long overdue. And I welcomed it. When the day of the bank meeting arrived, I felt a curious mix of anticipation and quiet triumph, not because I enjoyed confrontation, but because for the first time in years I held a vantage point that no one in my family had anticipated. And as we walked into the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby, I could see Ryan's casual confidence beginning to fray around the edges, like wallpaper peeling in the corners, and my parents followed closely behind, their smiles tight and rehearsed, giving the impression that they expected this performance to go according to their script, which was, as usual, one where I would quietly sign away my stability to bail out their golden child without question or complication. I greeted the loan officer with polite warmth, and she immediately recognized the seriousness of my preparation, the meticulous attention to detail that had gone into compiling every relevant document, every transaction, every minor discrepancy that I had found, and she allowed me the first words, the privilege of explaining the purpose of the meeting, which I did with the calm precision of someone laying out a map to a territory that others had long ignored. And I made sure Ryan heard everything, down to the smallest note about the auto loans, the credit cards, and the gambling apps that had quietly drained his accounts, because public disclosure, even in polite tones, has a way of turning charm into defensiveness and bravado into discomfort, and I wanted him to feel every ounce of accountability that had been hidden from him for years. I asked Ryan to read aloud the loan documents, clause by clause, and as he stumbled over the language, his brow furrowed and his usual smirk faltered, replaced by a reluctant focus, and I could see my parents' faces twitch with unease because, for once, their son was not in command, their reassurance had no place, and the authority that had shielded him from consequence was temporarily suspended by the very system they had hoped I would manipulate in his favor, and I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction as the bank officer nodded, taking notes and asking questions that forced him to explain choices he had never intended to defend. I interjected only to clarify minor points, phrasing every statement in a way that sounded cooperative and supportive, yet highlighted gaps in financial discipline, and when I casually mentioned Ryan's past gambling history, not as an accusation but as a procedural note, I noticed the subtle shift in the officer's expression, a raise of an eyebrow that communicated skepticism, concern, and the kind of accountability my family had so long evaded. And I kept the conversation moving with calm precision, making sure that every misstep Ryan had made, every lapse in judgment, was present in the room and recorded in the official files, leaving no room for charm or excuses to override reality. Ryan's frustration grew as I pressed on, forcing him to confront obligations he had treated as optional, and while my parents whispered for mercy under the pretense of family concern, I maintained the narrative of fairness and procedural diligence, ensuring that every participant understood that if the loan were to proceed, it would be with complete transparency, and that any attempt to conceal debts, obligations, or irresponsible spending would nullify the process entirely, which it inevitably did because Ryan was incapable of satisfying the requirements I had set forth without acknowledging truths he had spent years ignoring. When he finally stormed out, slamming the door in a gesture that was both dramatic and revealing, my parents turned to me with expressions of disbelief and frustration, accusing me of having ruined everything, while I maintained a calm, measured tone, pretending to be surprised that the procedure I had insisted upon had consequences, as if accountability were some foreign concept to them, and I allowed the silence to settle between us, heavy with the recognition that the narrative they had controlled for decades had fractured in a single morning, that the illusion of Ryan's invincibility had been punctured, and that the responsibility they had hoped to shift onto me had become a mirror reflecting their own failures and enabling. As they left my apartment, shoulders tight and voices low with the effort of containing their outrage, I finally let myself exhale, because the first act of a plan designed for justice had been executed with precision. And while I had not yet touched the deeper consequences, I knew the next moves would unfold without my direct intervention, and I savored the quiet knowledge that their reliance on my cooperation had been overestimated, that their expectation of loyalty without scrutiny had been dismantled, and that the scales were slowly, inexorably tilting toward equilibrium in a game they had always assumed they controlled, which gave me a measure of satisfaction that was both profound and quietly intoxicating, because revenge, in its most elegant form, is not instantaneous, but inevitable, and in that inevitability lay a comfort that was as sharp as it was deserved. By the time the dust settled from the bank confrontation, I realized that the situation was far from over, because the implications of what had happened that morning had rippled outward in ways my parents and Ryan could neither anticipate nor control. And as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the documents I had carefully compiled, I understood that the real leverage lay not in confrontation, but in the subtle, inexorable application of facts and timing, which meant that my next steps needed to be precise, deliberate, and ultimately irreversible if I wanted justice to be measured not by revenge in a moment, but by consequences that would unfold quietly yet convincingly over time. I began with the tax situation, discreetly contacting an anonymous tip line that allowed me to report unpaid obligations without revealing my identity, and while it may seem cruel to some, I understood that my parents' and Ryan's pattern of behavior had created a reality where accountability could no longer be deferred, and as I sent the information, I felt the sharp, almost electric satisfaction of knowing that someone, somewhere, would begin to scrutinize what had long been ignored, and that the safety net woven so carefully around Ryan would begin to fray under its own weight, leaving him to confront realities he had previously avoided with charm, excuses, or parental intervention. Simultaneously, I reached out to a friend who worked in real estate, simply inquiring whether there had been any recent sales or inquiries about my parents' gift to Ryan, and in what could only be described as serendipitous timing. She mentioned the property in casual conversation with clients who, coincidentally, had financial interest and connections that meant the word about the house began to circulate in a network that was entirely outside our family's control. A network where social and financial reputations matter more than familial loyalty, and I understood immediately that the indirect pressure was as effective as any direct action. Because rumors and outside scrutiny have a way of turning privilege into liability almost overnight. Meanwhile, Ryan, still fuming from the meeting at the bank, had begun to realize that his usual strategies for avoiding responsibility were failing, and as I watched the unfolding events with quiet attention, I could see him attempting to negotiate, to charm, to minimize, but with every step he took, the walls his parents had built around him seemed more transparent, more fragile, and the carefully constructed narrative of entitlement and favoritism began to crack under the weight of facts. deadlines, and procedural realities that could no longer be ignored, leaving him in a space where decisions mattered and consequences were unavoidable. The most satisfying part of the unfolding sequence was observing my parents, who had believed that every move could be predicted and manipulated, confronted with the reality that their expectations of unquestioning loyalty from me were obsolete. And as they navigated phone calls, whispered conferences, and the dawning realization that the house they had gifted was no longer a symbol of their generosity, but a potential financial liability, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and reflection. Because while the justice was unfolding as I had anticipated, I also understood that family dynamics are rarely neat, and that even clever, deliberate action carries the weight of personal cost, emotional strain, and the permanent alteration of relationships. In the following days, the IRS letters began to arrive at the house, and I received subtle confirmation from my friend in real estate that inquiries about the property had escalated, meaning that the pressure on Ryan to address his debts, liquidate assets, or negotiate terms had reached a level where evasion was no longer possible, and as I watched him confront the consequences that had been decades in the making, I experienced a sense of closure that was not entirely satisfying because it was measured, quiet, and indirect, but it was fair, undeniable, and elegantly proportional to the years of favoritism and avoidance that had created the crisis in the first place. As I reflected on the series of actions that had led to this moment, I understood that my decisions had not been born of malice, but of necessity, that the patterns I had observed, documented, and leveraged had created an inevitability that no charm, no pleading, and no parental intervention could override, and I allowed myself a small, private smile at the thought that for once, the truth had consequences, that responsibility had weight, and that my position as the one who had been consistently responsible was no longer something to be taken for granted, but a quiet authority that commanded respect through foresight, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to fairness, even when others had long avoided it. In the end, I did not gloat. I did not confront them directly beyond what was necessary, and I allowed the sequence of events to unfold, knowing that the consequences of their choices would reach a natural conclusion. And as I sat alone in my apartment, reflecting on the intricacies of family, favoritism, and the subtle but powerful influence of patience and preparation, I realized that the lesson was not only about Ryan or my parents, but about the power of deliberate action, measured justice, and the importance of understanding that sometimes the most profound consequences are those that arrive quietly, with inevitability, and leave room for reflection, thought, and the contemplation of choices that might never be undone. And as the sun set and the apartment filled with a gentle, reflective silence, I understood that while I had shifted the balance, the story was far from simple. The resolutions were complex, and the questions about loyalty, fairness, and family bonds would linger in the mind long after the final documents were signed, and the house was no longer a gift, but a responsibility that Ryan and my parents would have to navigate without relying on me, which left me with a sense of both peace and ambiguity that was as satisfying as it was thought-provoking. And as I turned off the light and prepared for sleep, I knew that in the quiet aftermath, I had ensured that justice, measured, patient, and inevitable, had been served.